Hello students, my name is Vaishali and I welcome you all to this lecture. The name of the topic is Stakeholders Analysis. So let's get started with the presentation. Let's have a look at the various topics which we will be covering in this presentation. Meaning and significance of stakeholders. Categories of stakeholders like internal stakeholders, connected and external stakeholders with their respective objectives and what they seek from the organization. Then we'll define the term stakeholder analysis. Further, we'll look into stakeholders conflict and then Mendelow's power interest matrix to resolve the stakeholders conflict. Further, we will look into the action plan that can be made with the help of this power interest matrix. And finally we'll conclude with the listing of the steps involved in stakeholder analysis. So let's look at the meaning of the term stakeholder. A stakeholder is an individual or a group who has an interest in what the organization does or who affects or can be affected by the organization's actions. So a stakeholder is somebody who can affect or be affected by the actions or inactions of a business, and they can exist both within and outside of a business. Let's look at how the term is defined by Stanford Research Institute. So according to Stanford Research Institute, stakeholders are those groups without whose support the organization would cease to exist. So different stakeholders have different interests and companies often face trade-offs in trying to please all of them. Now we need to understand that it is very important for managers to understand the varying needs of the different stakeholders in their organization, because failure to do so could mean that important stakeholders do not have their needs met, which could be disastrous for the company. Stakeholders can be broadly classified into three groups: internal, external and connected. Let's look at these three groups in detail in further discussion. First category is internal stakeholders. Now these are the stakeholders that are within the organization itself, and their objectives are likely to have a stronger influence on how the organization is run. Let's look at some of the examples of internal stakeholders and their objectives. First is employees. Now employees are the people that are employed by the business and they are directly involved in its activities. Some of the objectives of an employee are: 1. They would need a contract of employment that states all the rights and responsibilities of the employees. Second, they would want a regular payment for the work done. Then employee would also want job satisfaction and also motivation from the job. Then last but not the least, employees would want job security, that is the ability to be able to work without any fear of being dismissed or made redundant from the job. Second set of internal stakeholders are managers and directors. Now managers and directors are also employees, but they control the work of others. Managers are in charge of making key business decisions. So some of the objectives of managers and directors would be a secure job. Just like a regular employee, they also aim towards a secure job. Secondly, higher salaries. Now a manager's or a director's job requires more skill, time and effort, so they require higher salaries. Thirdly, Managers would also wish for business growth, as well as a bigger business means that managers can control a bigger business as well. Next are connected stakeholders. Now connected stakeholders are the ones who either invest in business or have dealings with the firm. For example, shareholders, customers, suppliers and finance providers. Let's look at the objectives of each one of these. Now, shareholders or owners are the risk takers of the business. They invest in their capital to set it up and expand it, and they are also liable to a share of the profits made by the business. Shareholders would expect a rate of return on their capital that they have invested into the business and therefore have profit maximization as their objective. Secondly, shareholders would want business growth, as this will ensure that the value of the shares will increase. Secondly, customers. Customers are also a very important part of every business, as they purchase and consume the goods and services that business provides. Successful businesses use market research to find out the customer preferences before producing the goods. A customer would want a price that reflects the quality of the good. He would want products must be safe and reliable to use. That is, there should not be any false advertisement of the product, and products must be well designed and of a perceived quality. Then suppliers as connected stakeholders are very important to the business, as success of one will impact the success of another. Business and suppliers are interdependent. As a result, suppliers are closely related to organizations as a key stakeholder. Timely payments, shipments, communication, and operational processes are key to maintain a strong relationship with this stakeholder group. Next are finance providers like banks. So banks provide financial help for business operations, and banks will expect the business to be able to repay the amount that has been lent along with the interest on it. So the banks have business liquidity as their objective. Now next are external stakeholders. Now external stakeholders are those that do not have a direct link to the organization, but they can influence or be influenced by the activities of the organization. For example, the community at large, or government, or trade unions. Now for example, the community, which consists of all the stakeholders, especially the third parties that get affected by the activities of the business, would want that a business offers job and employment to the local people. They would want that the production process of the business must in no way harm the environment, and they would want the products to be socially responsible so that they do not pose any harmful effects if people consume them. Same with second set of external stakeholders would be government. The role of the government is to protect the workers and customers from the activities of the business and safeguard their interest. Now, a company's or an organization's activities are very important for the functioning of an economy, since they provide jobs and taxes. Actions by companies could break the law or damage the environment. So the government therefore wants to control what the organizations can do. So some of the objectives of the government would be, they would want the business to grow and survive. as that will bring a lot of benefit to the economy. They would want a business to be successful since it will increase the total output of the country and further increasing the employment and the revenue of the government as well by payment of taxes. And they would expect the firm to stay within the rules and regulations which are set by them. The third set of external stakeholders, trade unions. So trade unions would want to take an active part in the decision making process, because now suppose if a department is to be closed, then the union would want that they should be consulted and there should be a scheme for the re-employment of those who are displaced by this action. So now that we have seen what is a stakeholder and have grouped them into different categories, so a stakeholder analysis is a process of identifying various stakeholders before the project begins and grouping them into different stakeholder groups based on their level of participation, interest and influence on the group. It is best to analyze the stakeholders because then the strategies can be made to look at factors like how to communicate with them and how to satisfy their interest. Now that we have discussed that there are different types of stakeholders in the business like internal, connected and external, and all these groups have different interests and priorities. So sometimes these interests can conflict. For example, the owners would generally seek high profits. So when the business wants to pay higher wages to its staff, the owners may be reluctant. Same way, if a business decides to move the production overseas to reduce the staff cost, it will benefit the owners, but it will work against the interest of the existing staff who may lose their jobs. And even customers may also suffer if they receive a poorer service because of this move. Another example would be that managers may want to pay for goods later so that they can improve their cash flow now, whereas the suppliers will want their payments to be released as soon as possible. So this move will be counterproductive for one party and beneficial for the other. Same way, suppose managers would want the highest profit possible on sales, whereas the customers would want reasonable prices for high quality products from the business. So in the event of conflict, an organization will need to decide which stakeholders' needs are important than the others. This will commonly be the most dominant stakeholder or the one with the most power whose needs will be given priority. Now if an organization is having difficulty deciding who the dominant stakeholder is, then they can use Mendelow's power interest matrix. Now Mendelow suggests that we analyze our stakeholder groups based on power and interest. Power here refers to the bargaining power or the right or ability to exert influence over the organization's aims and generally the way it conducts itself. And interest would be the interest in the activities or conduct of the organization for various reasons. Now remember that all stakeholders may seem to have a lot of power, or we would hope that they have a lot of interest, but relatively some stakeholders will hold more power than the others and some stakeholders will have more interest than the others. For example, a director is likely to have higher power and higher interest in the organization, whereas the government will have high power to impact via regulations, but potentially it will have lesser interest in the organization. So let's look at creating an action plan. So the position that you allocate to a stakeholder on the grid shows you the actions that you need to take with them. So for high power, highly interested people, the aim is to fully engage these people, making the greatest efforts to satisfy them. So high power, high interest, manage closely. Next, high power, less interest. Just put enough work to keep them satisfied, but not so much that they become bored with your message. So high power, less interest, keep satisfied. Now low power, highly interested people. So adequately inform these people and talk to them to ensure that no major issues are arising, as these audiences can also help point out any areas that could be improved or have been overlooked. So the message with low power, high interest people, keep them informed. Then the last one, low power, less interest. Don't bore these stakeholders with excessive communication. Just keep a close eye that if their levels of interest or power changes. So the message here is to monitor them. Now one thing to note here is that the stakeholders can move between the quadrants. There can be some changes in the outside environment which will lead to movement of stakeholders from one quadrant of the grid to another quadrant. Now, for example, your organization might have intervened in a regulation which would cause a regulatory body or government to move from high power low interest to high power high interest quadrant. This would then require a different way of managing and communicating with this stakeholder. Same way, media would move from low power low interest to low power high interest. So it's always worth double checking your grid in the event of a change in the environment or a project issue that may arise later. So let's look at the steps involved in the stakeholder analysis process. First, we identify and classify the stakeholders. This can be done by using any framework. Like here in the presentation, we have used Mendelow's matrix. After identification of the groups, we need to understand the values, aims and influences of these different stakeholders identified and any collective relationships that exist between them. Third, prioritize the stakeholders. So key players that you could think of, we can further rank them on the basis of scores. After that, we need to develop strategies to manage the relations with different stakeholders that we identified. So we could use consultation, communication, or building better relationships through regular contact, education or frequent consultation. And then finally, we also need to frequently undertake this stakeholder analysis so that if there is any change in the stakeholder position, then we need to change our strategy accordingly, as we had witnessed in our Mendelow's analysis.